Hello, everyone. Today is June 29th, 2023. My guest today is James Nieh, Professor of Ecology, Behavior, and Evolution at University of South California, San Diego. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Professor James.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here as well. So I first found your work and your lab's work through an article in the Times of San Diego where they were speaking towards this program called Bee City. And they mentioned you and you speaking towards it. What is your association with Bee City and what is Bee City?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So I've been thinking a long time with several other folks and organizations about the best way to achieve multiple goals, which include protecting our pollinators that are so important, increasing biodiversity, protecting habitat, and generally increasing sustainability for the city of San Diego. So one of the things that we thought of was joining a program called Bee City, which is run by the Xerces Society. And although it's called Bee City, I should explain it's not just about bees, and that's why I began by talking about pollinators. A really important thing that I want to make sure people understand is that the Xerces Society is focused on invertebrate preservation, but broadly what they're talking about is pollinator preservation. And that means hummingbirds, it means bats, in some places even means frogs and rodents, but of course butterflies, bees, many of the other insects that we think about. So my role in Bee City is to try to get this initiative through so that San Diego can help its pollinators increase native plants, sustain biodiversity, and really do all the things that we want in our environment to preserve our community.
Wow, that sounds great. And how did you begin becoming passionate about, ecology, pollinators, and how, biodiversity?
Sure. So I have started out many years ago, over 25 years ago now, studying bees. And I began my work on honeybees, which most people are familiar with because they're important for pollinating plants, particularly our food. But then for my PhD, I actually did a lot of work on these bees called stingless bees that most people have not heard about. They are tropical, found in all tropical parts of the world, but they are also very important pollinators. And then at times I've also worked on bumblebees as well. So I've had a long interest in pollinators, stingless bees, honeybees, and bumblebees. And part of what got me interested and motivated to work on Bee City is the increasing decline in honeybee health that I have directly seen in my research, but also the decline in the health of many other kinds of bees that I've heard about from my colleagues and read about in the literature. And for that reason, I think it's really important that we try to stem this mass extinction of pollinators that's unfortunately going on.
So the mass extinction of pollinators extends past bees and past the honeybee, correct?
Correct. Many people are probably familiar with the monarch butterflies and how they have to migrate annually from North America to a very special place in Mexico and then come back, and how that population seems to have been better this last year than previous years. Overall, it is threatened. And these are just one example. People know about honeybees, which are not really threatened, but they do have poor health. We have monarch butterflies whose populations are in peril. And then we have many other kinds of bees. There are species of bumblebees that have essentially now gone extinct in North America through a variety of reasons, many of which are related to habitat, pesticide use, the same things that affect our honeybees. So what I wanted to emphasize is that although honeybees are not in any danger of extinction, they're too important for our human food supply, and so we're taking steps to help honeybees, there are a lot of other pollinators out there that are not linked to agriculture, and therefore they're not really getting the care that they need to survive.
And when you say that, I think of something akin to, the domestic chicken or the domestic cow. Those aren't in any danger of being, brought, going extinct, but there are a lot of wild species which, when their wild lands are, farmed, or agriculture is brought on, or industry, whatever it may be, then those wild species suffer.
That's right. Yeah. I think that those wild species are really something you think about. We think about cows, hoof and mouth disease, and although we can treat that in the cows, in many of the other animals, it can be a problem because they're not necessarily getting the same treatment, the same medications that we can provide to our domestic cattle.
Okay.
And sorry about that. It's a shared office, so there was a brief interruption. Hopefully that's okay.
That's okay. That's no issue. Okay. And your lab has studied the disturbances within these populations, directly. Is that correct?
So we've looked at honeybees specifically, and we've looked at the effects of pesticides on bees. And that's one of the things that Bee City would like to do to reduce the use of pesticides in the city of San Diego. We've also looked at the effect of poor nutrition on these bees, because it turns out that they interact when bees are starving and they don't have enough nectar nutrition. They become much more susceptible and die more readily in response to even a low dose of pesticides. We've also looked at the effects of disease on bees, and these are diseases that are native to honeybees. And we're really trying to figure out ways to help bees that have been affected by disease or even affected by pesticide.
Okay. And how can these populations, or at least your, honeybees, based off of what you've, worked on, and possibly what other species, based off of what you read, what are some ways these populations can be strengthened?
So that's a great point. As with us, good nutrition is the basis for our immunity, our strength to resist multiple challenges. So we know that when bees have good nutrition, and honeybees, and most of bees I'm talking about, typically just consume nectar and pollen. So that's what I mean. They need a diverse diet. So just like us, we can't just eat one thing. Bees can't just have one kind of pollen. They need many different kinds of pollen because each pollen species has a different nutritional profile, and it provides certain more amino acids or certain omega fatty acids. Just like us, in fact, bees need the right balance of omega fatty acids. And so if bees are only given one crop, or their natural habitat has been devastated and it's been overrun by native plants or certain kinds of weeds, they can no longer get that balanced nutrition. And what we found in collaboration with other researchers is that this really has a negative effect on bees. So just as one example, I have a master's student in my lab who is now a PhD student, Paul LaDuca, and he looked at what happens when bees don't get a balanced omega fatty acid diet. As humans, we know, okay, maybe I'm going to take fish oil, maybe I'll take salmon. All of these things are really important for building our healthy bodies. And when bees don't get the right balance of omega-3,6 fatty acids, they actually go into cognitive decline, much like we would. Their learning and memory is impaired. Their ability to communicate also decreases. Even their lifespan can decrease. Now, you might say, well, there's a lot of pollen out there, but it turns out that in a lot of man-made or human-altered habitats, the correct ratio of omega-3,6 fatty acids is no longer present. So, it's like if we went to the supermarket and there was just one type of food, it wouldn't be very good for us, and it wouldn't be very good for the bees.
Okay. And in these man-made environments, those nutrient imbalances, they just happen because the environment's altered so drastically.
That's right. And, just like us, animals will get a craving. For example, if you've been working out, sweating in the hot sun, you might come back home and have a sudden craving for salt because that's what your body needs. Bees also know what they need, And in a natural situation, they will communicate to each other and basically tell each other where to go to find that pollen that balances their nutrition. And that's really fascinating that bees can tell that to each other so they can bring back the food they need. But what's even more interesting to me is that they know this. They know that the food that they're collecting is missing something. And so they can get their nest mates to go out and bring in the balanced nutrition.
That's an amazing capability. And you mentioned through much of your work the concept of signals. What is a signal in relation to a bee?
Sure. I think the easiest way to think about it is a kind of animal language, which you might call bee language or bee communication. I should say that this is an animal language, which is very different from human language, but in some ways it's very complicated in bees, which is why I'm so interested in studying it. So honeybees have this incredible ability, just like you might say to your friend, okay, I want you to go and get some milk for me at the 7-Eleven. And they would say like, well, where's the 7-Eleven? And you could say, okay, you have to go north about 2 miles and you'll find the 7-Eleven. Bees actually have that ability as well through something called the waggle dance. So when a bee comes back inside the nest, she actually draws a small miniature map of where she went to find food. So for example, let's say the flower that she found, which has the good nutrition, is 2 kilometers away in the direction of the sun. So how does a bee tell another bee to go in the direction of the sun? Well, she basically inside the nest, and remember the nest of a honeybee, if you've ever seen it inside a tree or even inside a beekeeper's box, is completely dark and the combs are vertical. So the bee is then dancing, and by dancing I mean that she's waggling her body. And that's why it's called the waggle dance. She's literally shaking her abdomen and her head is pointed straight up. So that means go straight up, go in the direction of the sun to find the food. So how does she communicate how far to go? Well, this is where the map comes in. If you were drawing a map, the longer the line you made, the farther the distance to the food source. And that's what we're talking about in this waggle run. The longer she waggle runs, the greater distance to the food. So if it's 1 mile away, maybe she'll waggle run for 1 second, and that corresponds to a greater length. But if it's 2 miles away, she could waggle run for 2 seconds, meaning it's further away.
Wow. That's very, I mean, it doesn't seem too complex, but that's over your years of studying that, what have you interpreted from that?
So you're right, and I'm glad you said that. So hopefully that was a simple explanation, but there are a lot of complications to this. So just to follow up, remember I said if the food is in the direction of the sun, you go straight up. So if the food is in the opposite direction of the sun, then the bee will waggle dance straight down. Makes a lot of sense, right? What if the food is 90 degrees to the right of the sun? Well, then the bee is going to waggle dance 90 degrees to the right. So all of that should make sense. But if you think about it for a moment, the sun changes, right? So the sun is never constant. It's always moving in the sky. The bees know that inside their brain. And when they're young, they learn how fast and how far the sun moves in their local area, because this is different in different parts of the world at different times of year. And when they're dancing inside this nest, which I mentioned is totally dark, they can use this information. So sometimes when a bee is dancing for a long time, you can watch her shifting her body to track the motion of the sun or to compensate for that solar motion, even though she's in the pitch black. So it's complicated because they have to know where the sun is in their brain and then provide that information relative to where the sun is. They're so good at this that even if it's a cloudy day, you might say, well, if it's cloudy, no one can see the sun. What do? She still knows where the sun ought to be because she has an internal clock that tells her the time of day. And similarly, all the bees that are following her, that are trying to get this information, they also have internal clocks. They also know where the sun should be. So even though they can't see the sun, they still have a common frame of reference and they can understand each other.
That's incredible. And it seems like a similar, I don't want to say, would you say it's automated?
I would say it is largely instinctual, that bees have this encoded, but that actually brings us something interesting. We recently had a paper published in Science with the Kentan lab from China and myself, and we showed that bees need teachers. They need to learn. So just to go back to this waggle dance. So I've described what the bees are doing, and hopefully it's pretty clear, but now imagine that you're a bee. You're doing this pitch black, and it's vertical, right? So you're climbing a rock wall in the dark. You're doing it very fast. You're basically moving at 1 body length per second, which is a lot. And you're moving at high speed, and you have hundreds of other bees crushing around you, trying to follow you, blocking your movement. And all the while, you have to maintain the correct angle, the correct time, and do it correctly. And when I say a rock wall, I do mean that. So the nest surface can vary greatly. It can be these combs, but if you think about a comb, there's a big gap in the middle, right, of each cell. So the bee is literally clinging on to each of the walls as she's trying to run vertically in the correct way. So basically what we found is this, that if bees are never able to follow teachers, experienced bees, when they produce their first waggle dances to communicate food location, these waggle dances have a lot of errors. But if they were able to follow and observe experienced dancers, their teachers, while they were growing up, the first dances of these bees are nearly perfect. So even though they haven't been able to practice it, just by following the teachers, they're able to learn and to do it much better. And I think that underlies the complexity of what they have to do because they need teachers.
Wow. That I've heard something akin to that with learning a language, that the memory and the repetition in doing that and having a reference bank of someone saying this particular word or the sentence in a grammatical way is similar. It's not just, oh, the grammar and it's good to go. It's also there needs to be a memory bank. And for you to mention that about a study that you've paired up with to do about bees is also pretty incredible to see that learning pattern that's somewhat similar, but on a much, I don't know how simple that is.
It's really interesting because I mentioned that we were looking at the first dances the bees ever make. Bees, when they're young, don't dance. They only dance when they're older. So that was one key to the experiment. But following a dancer is very different from dancing. So think about like if you're on Dancing with Stars and the instructor is doing the Argentinian tango, right? Like you can see the instructor doing it, and maybe you could even like follow the dancers as they're moving around, but it's still really different from doing the tango. And it's the same thing. The bees are following these teachers, but they're not actually doing it. But just by the process of following it in the complete dark on a vertical surface, so they can't see it, but they probably touch and sense the dancer in certain ways, they're still able to do it much better the first time. So I think it's really interesting, and there are a lot of questions that we hope to study in the future.
Those will be, hopefully you receive the answers and, those are exciting questions.
Thank you. Yeah, we think it's really interesting also because, of course, they're not just following the dancer, they're also getting the information about where to go for food. So somehow all of that information about how to do it, the correct muscle memory of how to make the dance, but also how to interpret it is probably tied together. And I think it's a really interesting thing to understand.
And do you believe that the mechanism to understand which foods have the correct nutrient balance for what they need at the moment, is that a learned behavior as well?
That's really interesting. We haven't looked at that, but I'm really glad you brought that up. So how does the colony know what nutrients it needs? So let's say you're going out and you are collecting sunflower pollen and you bring it back. And then you have other bees that are coming back and they're bringing, let's say, eucalyptus pollen. In San Diego, a lot of bees collect eucalyptus pollen in the winter. The colony will kind of judge. Now, the cool thing about this is that no one bee actually knows everything in the colony. It's sometimes called the hive mind or the superorganism. But the colony will judge and say, okay, this sunflower pollen is good, but it doesn't have everything we need. In fact, right now we need more eucalyptus pollen. So they will communicate that to the dancers, and the bees that come back from the eucalyptus pollen will dance more. So the more times they dance, the more nest mates will go out to find that particular resource. So that way they can shift their allocation to, for example, okay, 2/3 of our diet should now be eucalyptus pollen and 1/3 will be the sunflower pollen, but it's all going to be mixed together. And then when we achieve that mix and feed it to our larvae, our baby bees, we're going to have a healthy, well-developed brood, a healthy colony.
Wow. And you mentioned the superorganism, and that is one colony of bees.
That's right. We can think of, so I should explain that term. We are multicellular organisms. We've got millions of cells inside our body. And a lot of these cells have different functions, right? We have brain neurons, we have muscle cells. All of these have a different role. And usually, any individual cell is not really that critical. You might lose a muscle cell, it might die. You might even lose a brain cell. In fact, as we get older, we're losing brain cells all the time, but it doesn't mean the organism is going to die. And a honeybee colony is very similar. So you can have over 30,000 bees inside a honeybee colony. They tend to have different functions. When they get older, they're foragers. When they're younger, they are nurse bees that take care of the younger bees. And then you have the queen bee. The queen bee is really important, but she's actually not so essential. If she dies, the other bees, her daughters, can raise a new queen bee. So it's a system where no one bee knows everything. Just like in our bodies, there's no one cell that knows everything. But together they work together to preserve the fitness of the entire superorganism, or in our case, a multicellular organism.
Okay. And how long in the wild would a bee superorganism, how long can one survive?
That's really interesting. Potentially an unlimited amount of time. And the reason for this is that a queen might live for 1 to 2 years, but then she could die, and she's actually can be even killed by her own daughters if she's a bad queen. Basically, a bad queen is one that doesn't lay viable eggs, and they can tell that. But as each queen dies, she's replaced by one of her daughters. Now, you might say, well, it's always the same genetic material, right? So at some point, it's got to die. But each queen will go out, each virgin queen, and mate with drones outside in the environment. And they can mate with 14 to 18 different drones. So even though the maternal genetic line is preserved, with every generation, with every new queen generation, you're getting a lot of new genetic material from drones outside. So I guess the question that people are probably thinking about was like, how old is the oldest honeybee colony? And unfortunately, we don't have an answer to that, in part because the colony is always genetically refreshing itself every couple of years. We do know of places, tree cavities and so on, where colonies have inhabited for quite a long time. Now, whether or not that is the same colony that's requeened itself or whether the colony has left and been replaced, it's unclear. But potentially, a honeybee colony in this way is immortal. Although, I should qualify that and say, well, maybe it's not so crazy. Think about a human family, right? So a human family is potentially immortal as well. Keep on reproducing, having new kids. Your kids go off, marry, have their kids, and you can have many, many generations.
Okay. And how many bees is normal for a colony or a superorganism?
So superorganisms can have millions of individuals. Here I'm thinking about army ants and even some leafcutter ants. But in honeybees, I would say, about 30,000 bees up, 30, 40, 50,000 bees is pretty normal for an Apis mellifera colony.
Okay. And through your work with Bee City, you mentioned that, you know, your research is with bees, but then Bee City is more pollinators, and you mentioned past wild species of bees or non-honeybee species of bees. You mentioned, I believe, hummingbirds and bats, and also toads. So, have you had to learn more about those species, or how have you been able to apply your work with bees to these other pollinators?
So these animals are all really different and diverse, and usually biologists are pretty specialized on one type of organism. I will say that where my work and my interests overlap is in these plants that are being pollinated. And the fact is that if we plant more native plants that are drought tolerant, which is really important in the Southern California area that I'm in, that this can help sustain a large community of bees and other pollinating insects, and can even have effects on birds as well. So there's a flower called the California monkey flower. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it typically comes in different variations. It can go from yellow to red. And this is an example of a flower that is pollinated by bees, bumblebees usually, or in some cases by hummingbirds. So by preserving these native populations of monkey flowers, we can potentially impact not only bees, but also the birds as well.
That's very exciting. And I'm a San Diego native, and it's very exciting to have someone like yourself thinking about this and knowing that there's a society out there, programs out there assisting cities become more ecologically minded, and thinking about how we can interact with our environment in a healthier way.
Yes, I totally agree. And I just wanted to add one important thing about Bee City is education. There's a very large component of education, everything from school kids to adults, where we really want to teach people, number one, about pollinators. So many people that I've met are surprised that there is more than just one kind of bee. They tend to think that the only bee is a honeybee. Whereas the amazing thing about San Diego and San Diego County is that we have one of the greatest diversity of bees in the world, and not many people realize that. There are over 650 different species of honeybee just in San Diego County. So it's really a special place with respect to bee diversity. And what's even more special is that if you look at some place like Anza Borrego Desert, which is very beautiful and people enjoy, these areas are actually where a lot of the biodiversity is. You might look at it and think, wow, this looks really dry. There's sand everywhere, or it just looks like rocks. But maybe one reason why these areas are so diverse is that it's kind of hard to live there. So a lot of these species have specialized to fill a different ecological niche, meaning they fill a different life cycle. And that has led to this great diversity of species. So that's one example of education that I think is really cool for people to learn. And I can imagine kids being really excited about this, to learn that in their own backyard, they are living in a natural wonder.
Yes, they would be very excited, even kids, but also adults, because we think, oh, desert, Anza Borrego, like you said, sands, rocks, doesn't seem like much, but then you also mentioned 650 species of honeybee in the county. That's incredible diversity. And did the diversity of the honeybee and of the bee population bring you out to San Diego? And
So, sorry.
no, continue.
Yeah. So actually it was family. My mother lived in Los Angeles, and I wanted to be closer at home to family when I was looking for jobs. And so I applied for a position at UC San Diego when it opened up. And this was about 23 years ago. And that's really why I'm here. But I guess it is linked because I've always wanted to live in a place with good weather, someplace that I could do bee experiments and do my research. And so that was one of the natural draws of San Diego.
That's great. And when you were studying, did you also know you wanted to be, you just mentioned one of the great, privileges of being a part of Bee City is that you're able to educate the public about these various topics and about ecology within the local area. And so before you did become a professor, were you also pretty certain that this was the path that you eventually wanted to take?
So when I was in college as an undergraduate, I tried a bunch of different things. And I think I was drawn to science, but it wasn't until my senior year that I took a course on animal behavior. And I actually learned about the honeybee waggle dance, what I've just been describing. And it was just amazing to me. I couldn't believe that there was an animal that could actually do this. And so that summer, I did a research project with one of the professors who was there. And because he actually, unfortunately, got injured, he's okay, or he was okay, but I was kind of left to myself to work with the bees. And so I had the freedom to frame my own research questions and essentially to do my own research instead of doing what another professor was telling me to do. And I found that very exciting. And so I then decided to work on bees. And that was really the start of it. I then went to get a PhD at Cornell University with Tom Seeley, who I had actually met before, that summer before, to learn how to deal with bees as an undergraduate for this research project. So I think that kind of got the ball rolling from taking a course that excited me to having a research experience where I could actually have the freedom to do what I wanted, to finally meeting my future PhD advisor.
That's very exciting to, seem to follow your passion and then find a career from that. So, Professor James and I, we've spoken a lot about bee colonies, ecology, preserving pollinators, and how pollinators are associated with each other and how bees are able to communicate and teach and learn. Are there any, highlights of what you've spoken about, or, a large portion of the listeners are Californians and San Diegans. Are there any last notes you'd like to leave our audience?
Sure. I wanted to address two things and to connect them. First of all, people often ask me, what's up with the bees? Why are they dying? And the answers are very similar for honeybees and for our native bees. So number one, we have pesticides, which are designed to kill pest insects, but bees are also insects, and pesticides usually can't tell the difference. They're not that specific. So pesticides are affecting native bees and honeybees. Second thing is diseases. There are viruses like deformed wing virus, which are common to many different kinds of insects. They're found in native bees, they're found in honeybees. And then we have human management practices. So this does apply mainly to honeybees, but it can apply also to bumblebees because there are some bumblebees that are produced and shipped around for pollinating crops in greenhouses. The crux of it is that some of the things that we do in mass agriculture, people might not know, but every year millions of honeybee colonies are shipped to the Central Valley to pollinate our almond crop, which is worth more than $2 billion. So it's a very valuable crop. Depends almost entirely on honeybee pollination. But when they're brought in at this high density, 2 million colonies is a lot of colonies, they can exchange diseases. They're literally placed right next to each other in the field next to the almond trees So bees might get lost. So if I am sick or I have a parasite, I might get lost and go to the next colony, and then that parasite jumps off and can infect a new colony. So management practices. And also, of course, the parasites and diseases like varroa mites that affect honeybees. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is I probably haven't distinguished what I mean by native bees versus honeybees. People might think, wait a second, I thought honeybees were native here. Honeybees are actually not native to the New World. They were introduced by European settlers. And prior to their introduction, we have native species of bees in the New World. We have many solitary bees, we have social bees, we have bumblebees, things like that. So just wanted to clarify that. Nowadays, people have probably heard about Africanized bees or feral honeybees. That does make up a huge part of the population. So connecting to that, I just wanted to end on this potential conflict between honeybees and native bees. It's really hard to get data because nobody was here sampling the native bees before the Europeans introduced honeybees. But it's thought that the honeybee introduction has probably reduced the population and the diversity of our native bees, which is, a problem. Right now, connecting with Bee City, many people are talking about save the bees. And I want to be clear that what that mainly means is saving our native bees. But a lot of people also love honeybees, and they're really important for us. Even in San Diego, for example, our biggest agricultural crop is avocados. Avocados pollination depends almost entirely on honeybees, not on native bees. So we're kind of in this synergy. We need to help the honeybees for agriculture, for the human things that we get out of them, but we also need to help the native bees. So I think the best way forward is to increase the biodiversity of the plants that all of these bees can feed on, and then it can be a win-win both for the native bees and for the honeybees.
My guest today is Professor James Nieh. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Professor James.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.